Well, kia ora tātou. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Because of the extraordinary coincidence that the last partnership forum in Christchurch coincided with our own tragedy, on behalf of the New Zealanders here, I'd just like to acknowledge the tragedy that fell on the people of Oklahoma. And I was brought up, my parents were both professional actors, so I was brought up on the poetry of Shakespeare and the music of Rodgers and Hammerstein. And those lyrics meant for much happier times. Oklahoma, where the wind comes sweeping down the plain. So we want to acknowledge to our American friends the tragedy that fell on the city, with particular ferocity on the school, the elementary school, and we acknowledge your loss. Now, TPP. I want to talk about TPP, but I really want to put it in a broader strategic framework. Because what is happening to the architecture of trade policy and trade and investment integration is very, very interesting indeed. If you think of it schematically, what we have here is, because it takes an institutional form, is the center of the system, which is the multilateral trading system, the WTO, could be seen like this, with the periphery being all of these regional trade agreements, FTAs, customs unions, closer economic relations exercise, call them what you will. And what is actually happening is similar, in my view, to, I think they're called orbiters. You take your children in a playground fair onto this thing that goes round and round. You start in the center, and the centripetal forces, as it accelerates, throw you and your kids, or in my case, grandchildren, to the periphery. That is essentially what is happening because the center has completely lost momentum. Now, I've spent the last 6 months talking about this subject, so I do not intend to repeat myself now in terms of analysis to why. Although I think it's very important to remember the direction of causality here. It is not that these regional trade agreements are, in effect, taking the oxygen out of the center. It is because the center is not moving that the United States, the #1 economy in the world, and many other economies are now moving to the periphery. What is really intriguing is that although conventional wisdom might suggest, against the background of the biggest economic setback for 70 years, well, of course, the WTO is not moving forward. What would you expect with massive unemployment in the developed world in particular? But actually, that's completely wrong. Far from the difficult economic conditions turning people away from trade and investment integration agreement, there has been an explosion of interest in trade and investment integration, except that it's all happening at the periphery, not the center. And there's a couple of interesting characteristics that deserve a little bit of contemplation. The first is, unlike many of the agreements that were negotiated in the 1980s and 1990s, they are high quality. They're not low quality at all. Now, there will be exceptions to this because of the ferocity of the pace with which these are being negotiated. But certainly the FTAs that New Zealand has been involved in, often with Australia, are extremely high quality. The second thing that's happening is what I call convergence. Previously, the deal was you negotiate a bilateral deal. What is now happening is that these bilateral FTAs, by whatever name, are imploding on each other to form larger and larger aggregations of trade and investment integration. North America is a classic example. There used to be an FTA between Canada and the United States. Technically, it still exists, but this is a legal fiction. Very quickly, the FTA between Canada and the United States imploded into a wider aggregation, which we know today as NAFTA. And TPP itself will get there, will result in NAFTA imploding itself into an even wider circle of trade and investment integration called TPP. Now, you can see this happening around the planet. European Union is still expanding, imploding as it goes several other trade agreements. When the United Kingdom and 2 other EFTA members joined in 1973, it was exactly this characteristic. We're seeing the same thing taking place in Russia. I'm in the middle of a negotiation, not with Russia, but intriguingly with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, the customs union that is emerging out of political and supply chain relationships that used to exist in the former Soviet Union, and we're the first country in the world to be negotiating with them. I hope to push this forward in the OECD meeting in Paris next week. But it's happening in Asia, outside TPP as well, with this other ghastly acronym called RCEP, which stands for Regional Closer Economic Partnership, which is a TPP-type exercise, except the giant economy is not the United States, which is not involved, but China, and involves 16 countries, all of which have FTAs with the ASEAN countries, trying to find a basis forward. Do not count this out, ladies and gentlemen. This will produce something. It's a much slower time than TPP. It's a much less mature negotiation. But once again, the pattern is FTAs, all the members have got FTAs with ASEAN. Now we're trying to combine them. Equally, in Latin America, very intriguing developments taking place. Latin America is dividing itself into 2, and it takes both an ideological and it takes an institutional form. So we have the long-established Mercosur agreement between Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, Paraguay, and Uruguay, which has got a number of, since this is a public meeting, I'll use the word challenges ahead of us. And then there's this very interesting new development, Pacific Alliance, which is the other giant Latin economy, Mexico, plus Colombia, Chile, Peru, and almost certainly others will join, starting, I think, with Costa Rica. And Australia and New Zealand have been accepted as observers. I'm on my way to Colombia this afternoon to attend the first meeting of the Pacific Alliance involving ministers from all countries plus observers. And this is essentially a deep integration model of people which, in spite of their tragic past, are trying to move forward. ANSFTA itself, which is completed, it's a done deal for my American friends. It's not under negotiation, it's been finished. Extremely high quality agreement, which combines the Australia-New Zealand FTA, called the CER, with that of ASEAN. So this is what TPP is about strategically. Now, it's been said in the past that a plan without a vision can become a nightmare, and a vision without a plan is hallucination. So we have a vision and we have a plan in TPP. And the vision is to create, as Bob has just said, a genuine, high-quality, 21st century agreement that can act as a template for free trade area of the whole of the Asia-Pacific. And this is not unobtainable if we have a long-term perspective in mind. That's the vision. But there's another vision that's entirely complementary that may take shape. If we look at the United States, still the world's #1 economic, political, military, strategic power, the United States is the common element of 2, as I've called them, strategic arms of US policy. One towards Asia, and now crucially Japan, called TPP. And the other, just about to be launched, we believe, in the next few weeks in a formal sense, TTIP, or the Trade and Investment Partnership Agreement between the United States and Europe. Truly an extraordinary development in terms of the architecture of the global economy. And the United States has a unique opportunity, in my view, being the only common element to both, to provide leadership and coherence between these 2 arms, and potentially do a reverse takeover of the WTO, basically. That's the potential vision. Now, in terms of what we're trying to do in TPP, the rhetoric, you know, the reality has yet to emerge. But let me give you some practical examples of what I think we're trying to see. We're trying to fix, first of all, some what I call the detritus of the 20th century problems now through this regional agreement. And I want to make it absolutely clear, New Zealand will not be a member of this agreement that puts aside our vital export interests in favor of some patchy little deal at the end. But it's absolutely crystal clear. We do not need, ladies and gentlemen, from the perspective of our country, another second-rate FTA. We have a wonderful platform to advance our strategic interests through China, through Asia, and the other emerging economies. But I'm confident we can achieve this. So you may remember, some of the more policy wonks in the audience, the phrase the spaghetti bowl, which characterized many of the second-rate FTAs of the late 20th century. Well, we're trying to clean up the spaghetti bowl in TPP. First of all, for the broader strategic reason I've just outlined, we're trying to combine these different agreements in a single agreement, imploding them into these wider aggregations. But also technically, we're negotiating rules of origin. This is not some minor technical point, by the way, it's fundamental. Into cumulative region-wide rules of origin, which connect the realities of the global value chain, which is such a dominant part of the North American economy, Mexico, Canada, US, but also the global value chain that's emerging in Southeast Asia and Australasia. So if you import any component, as we slice and dice the production chain into component bits, the rules of origin are designed to ensure that this qualifies for the preferential treatment that we're negotiating in TPP. It's one example. Another example is regulatory coherence. We all understand that while we still have to deal with some conventional trade policy problems, the real issues now are around issues behind the border and the need to establish coherence in regulatory frameworks through principles such as equivalence, which simply recognizes that, well, the example I always use is, I remember when I was negotiating for New Zealand the FTA with Singapore, which is essentially the foundation stone of TPP, saying to the Singaporean officials who had no experience of mutual recognition and equivalence, look, we can sell our refrigerators to you. We know that your electrical standards are slightly different, but our regulators are high-quality people with integrity. There are different ways to skin a cat, as it were. So as long as we can tell our customers that your method of wiring up a refrigerator is not going to electrocute our kids and vice versa, we don't have to have the same standard. Now, this is a simple, practical example of what I mean by regulatory coherence. We're also trying to develop rules around e-commerce that are truly consistent with the digital global economy that's taking place, and this means things like, online processing of standard customs forms. It may not be very exciting, but remember this, my comment about a vision without a plan is hallucination. This is the detailed plan, but the vision is very grand. The vision is very grand. We're also trying to ensure that we have very liberal temporary entry for to help the trading agreement. If we look at some of the underlying trends in global trade, what is clear is the boundaries between services and goods are breaking down. In fact, the whole measure of what constitutes services trade has been found by some outstanding recent research coordinated by the OECD. It's a very porous concept. And for the first time, we have the beginnings of an explanation as to how it was possible, when 70% of developed countries typically are services economies, that international trade and services is only 25%. Well, it turns out the figure is wrong. That a very large part of what we're counting goods trade incorporates services in it. And to give you a practical example, I was up a little while ago in a provincial town in New Zealand called Hamilton, and I went to see this little company which produces, well, I'd call it plastic casings for pickup trucks. I mean, it's not plastic, it's some high-tech thing. And I said, how can you export? There's about 120 jobs there. They're into the global value chain of GM and trying to get into the Volkswagen value chain. How can you compete exporting from New Zealand? And basically the picture is, well, not on price, but actually it's a services exporter. So it's both a manufactured exporter and it's a services exporter. So they're competing on the basis that they customize their product, and their people are going up into the Australian and Thai markets, which are their main markets, all the time. So it's a services exporter and a manufacturer. This tiny example from a provincial town in New Zealand is really being replicated globally. So we are trying to ensure that we have an agreement in TPP that recognizes these realities, that facilitates the entry of technicians and people related to the trade, because that is where we are going. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's always the case in trade that it's big picture stuff. It's gut-achingly difficult to do. I've never been involved in a trade agreement that was easy to negotiate. But I think we've got something of real value now, that the third largest economy in the world, Japan, is part of this deal. And while it's more complicated, the prize is very considerable. So I'm looking forward with great energy and commitment to the next year or two while we put this in place. Thank you very much.